It's always good to have conversations with people who are genuinely curious.
Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better?
Hello, I'm Greg Kosk, teaching assistant professor in the Oklahoma State University History Department and guest host of this episode featuring a conversation with Nick Romeo. Nick Romeo is a journalist and professor. He's a longtime contributor to the New Yorker magazine, but he's published widely for outlets like Slate, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and others. Today, he is also a lecturer at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Romeo recently published his first book, entitled The Alternative: How to Build a Just Economy. And the book begins with a wonderful chapter on the evolution of the field of economics and its pretensions to being an objective science, via its emphasis on mathematics and its exclusion of ethics, politics, and history. It's clear that you've got a deep appreciation for literature and history from the first couple of chapters here, Nick. And we're going to get to that in just a few moments. But I want to welcome you to this podcast and allow me to begin by simply asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself. You grew up in Colorado in the 80s and 90s. Tell us about that. What was your childhood and adolescence like in Boulder?
Thanks, Greg. Nice to be here. Boulder's a sort of picturesque college town at the foot of the Rockies. I had a fairly free-range childhood. Parents were not particularly concerned about where I was or when I returned, which was nice. Very different from a lot of kids today. Yeah. It was sort of idyllic and picturesque in general, I would say. Yeah.
And tell us maybe a little bit about your parents and what they did.
Sure. Yeah, so my parents are both musicians. They met in music school in a conservatory. My mom's a violinist. Dad is a singer. And my mom was in the symphony and had a private studio, so she taught violin. She actually had her own performing arts school in Boulder. My dad went to law school after getting a few degrees in music, and he did elder and disability law.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, from the background, I had assumed in a lot of ways that maybe they had taught at Boulder at UC, but that's a really fascinating background. So tell us a little bit about your experience at college. Did you want to go to college?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, just outside Chicago. I spent a lot of time playing piano. I'm a classical pianist, and I also spent a lot of time just kind of sampling a pretty broad range of courses. Northwestern's on the quarter system, so you can take many more courses than you could if you were at a school on semesters. So I sort of took seriously the advertising slogans that a lot of colleges deploy pretty cynically, and I just ended up following whatever I was interested in at a given time. So if I sort of got into something, I would read a lot on it, whether or not it was assigned for class, and spent a lot of college just kind of pursuing different interests fairly independently from the actual curriculum, which was often, hit and miss with quality of professors. So
yes, and as it is at any school, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of wondering about, I guess, your kind of trajectory into journalism. From that experience in undergrad, did you kind of have a sense of maybe one day that was something that you would like to do? Did you ever write for the student newspaper, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so Northwestern has a really good journalism school. I was not in it. I was in the Arts and Sciences College, but I did take some classes in it. One of the best professors there is a writer named Alex Kotlowitz, who wrote a famous book on the Chicago housing projects. And, it's a sort of long-form nonfiction book, so not dissimilar to the kind of stuff you might read in The New Yorker, very narrative and immersive, but entirely fact-based and reported. So I really did feel like the power of long-form journalism to transport people to different worlds. I thought that was pretty extraordinary. I was also, into fiction. I read a lot of fiction, and I felt like the journalism classes sort of, well, maybe I should back up and say that, when I took creative writing classes, people tended to write mostly about their own lives, sort of inward-facing, somewhat precious, solipsistic kind of prose, whereas the journalism stuff was very outward-facing. It was like you have to go learn about the world, you have to talk to other people who are different than you have to kind of understand their lives and their stories. So I found that like a refreshing contrast to...
It's good to maybe have both, right? But...
Yeah. I was interested in journalism, and I did love fiction as well. I mean, one of the things I remember clearly from undergrad was taking a class on Virginia Woolf's novels. And I was sort of very captivated by her prose and by her sort of intellectual command as well. I mean, her essays are just extraordinarily erudite and impressive. And so I asked the professor of the class, sort of, how does one become as good at writing and thinking as Virginia Woolf, basically? The sort of 19-year-old's naivete. It's just like, how do I do that? And the professor's advice was very sincere. And she said, well, the first thing you should do is learn ancient Greek, because Woolf read ancient Greek for pleasure, which was unique for a woman at that time in the early 20th century. It was, famously her essay, A Room of One's Own, is about not being able to access traditional education at Oxford or Cambridge. So it was unique to have Greek at that level. Her dad was a philosopher and had private tutors for her and her sister. But this professor said you should just start by learning ancient Greek and then just try to read very widely.
Interesting.
So that sort of planted a seed in my mind, like, maybe I should actually learn ancient Greek.
Yeah. And is that kind of what led you to eventually maybe study abroad? Because you did study abroad too, right, as an undergrad?
Yeah, that's right. That was a factor. So I ended up spending a semester in Athens, Greece, which was extraordinary in many ways. But I was initially kind of intrigued by this connection that Woolf had to ancient Greece. When she was writing Mrs. Dalloway, she was also translating Sophocles at the same time.
When you went to Greece, had you already taken some Greek at Northwestern, or was this something you were just jumping into?
Yeah, no. So I had no Greek when I arrived in Athens, ancient or modern. So I was already a senior also by the time I studied there, and so I really had to wait until graduate school to spend several years learning the language.
I think that is just absolutely critical, right? I mean, it's so important for us to recognize that, it's okay to jump into something late even in your college career, right? I mean, I think that goes for us professors too, right? I mean, I think so often there's a hesitance to kind of break out of our silos in so many ways, right? But this is just such a great lesson. You're a senior, you probably have other plans, and you're like, you know what? No, I'm going to Greece, right? And so that kind of set the trajectory for you in some ways. Could you talk about that too? Yeah.
So, a big influence on me in Greece was a professor of philosophy who was Greek-American named Kostas Kalimtzis, who's a sort of Aristotle specialist, and he taught a wonderful class on the entire history of ancient Greek philosophy. And, I was just very captivated by his sort of combination of intellectual rigor, but also practical concern with ethics and with the kind of questions that all of us face about how to live a good and meaningful life. And his ability to kind of muster the resources of ancient philosophy to bear on those questions, I thought was just extraordinary. So we became very close. He was a dear friend and mentor until his recent death during COVID. And so after a semester there, I sort of was reading a lot of philosophy in translation, but it was clear that many of the key concepts in Aristotle and Plato, when you sort of render them in English, they have all of this extraneous cultural baggage that actually distracts you from what the concept is pointing to. Happy to give examples if that's not too far afield, but it was important to understand how to sort of access the concepts in the most direct way possible. So that was the motive for learning Greek. And I spent a few years working in Manhattan and New York before I ended up going back to graduate school. So I was out for 3 years before I then went back to graduate school. And the first degree I got was in English literature. And I sort of did that mostly just because it was funded. And it was a way to sort of learn enough Greek that I could then get into a funded master's and study ancient philosophy in that master's.
This is super far afield from me, but I'm super interested in this. As I was kind of going through your bio, this stuck out to me. I mean, I would like to kind of hear from you about maybe what it is about that ancient Greek, reading in ancient Greek. How does it help us maybe get rid of some of that cultural baggage that we bring to these readings?
Yeah. So there are tons of examples. One good one is the word for leisure in ancient Greek is skoli, which is the origin of the word school and scholastic in English. So a lot of people don't associate school with leisure, right? They think it's actually the thing that deprives you of leisure. But we have a very sort of consumerist, like post-Thorstein Veblen concept of leisure, where leisure is a space of kind of relaxation from work. It's fairly mindless. It's like recuperative, hedonistic. So in ancient philosophy, I'm thinking of Aristotle and Plato, skoli has a sort of very precise concept. And it especially in the philosophers, it's always unclear how much you can infer from philosophical text into kind of social history, what other Athenians of the time would have understood. But within philosophical circles, skoli becomes a kind of space for the activation of mind. It's a place of intellectual inquiry. So it's a very different concept where, and it has to do with sort of, especially in Aristotle, like teleology and the purpose, or telos, the final end of a human, is the activation of your reason, your intellectual faculties. Skoli is like a necessary condition for that. So the reason you would want to work is not so that you could then go on vacation and drink margaritas. It's so that you could then like understand Aristotle's metaphysics. So that's just wildly foreign to a contemporary American way of thinking.
Yeah.
And it's not readily apparent, like if you read Aristotle in English translation, the translator has limited means of conveying the strangeness of the concept. You'll see the word leisure, you'll think of leisure as a sort of contemporary American, and you'll miss the whole story, right? So that's a clear example of how, and there are literally dozens of these instances where if it's better than nothing, I think, reading in English, but you do miss a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really powerful example of context matters, right? Yeah. And so I want to turn a little bit now to talking about how history informs your work. In particular, could you tell us how you see history as crucial to your thinking and writing, especially as it relates to the alternative?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in some ways, I'm a kind of unlikely candidate to write a book on economic policy. And, the way I got interested in economics was really through political philosophy. For a long time, economics was part of philosophy. It was sort of a branch of philosophy. There was questions within political philosophy that had to do with the production and distribution of economic goods. And so for a lot of the history of the field, the economy was not some separate naturalized sphere that was subject to study the same way, the natural world might be. It was sort of entangled with politics and ethics. that's how I got interested in it, was by reading political philosophy. So reading people like Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill or David Ricardo. I mean, a lot of the luminaries in the history of the field thought of themselves as philosophers, and that, I think, made them more inclined to deal directly with normative questions about justice, about distribution, what do we owe to each other, to the natural world, to future generations. These, I think, are really rich and interesting questions. And so, initially the kind of dryness of economics, right, where people hear the term and they might think about, like, what is the Fed doing with interest rates, or what are markets doing right now? How do tariffs work? I mean, I found those questions sort of limited interest compared to deeper questions about politics and ethics. And so realizing that actually economics, a lot of the questions it asks they're just special cases of philosophical questions. That was kind of my way in, was to see it as a branch of philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so was that happening, and just to kind of drill down on it, was that happening before you went back to graduate school? Was that happening during graduate or after graduate school for you?
Yeah, I mean,
because you seem like an inveterate reader, right? I know you're always reading, but I'm just kind of interested. Does that come through maybe these English Lit programs, or the classes that you're taking in your master's degrees?
No, it really came more from just my own reading, and after 2 master's degrees, I'd had enough of academia. Happy to say more about why that was the case, but my wife had not, and so she went out, and we went together to the Bay Area. She was doing a PhD at Stanford, and so we were right there in the heart of Silicon Valley, sort of an epicenter of economic inequality in America, and it was hard sort of not to notice that. I was working as a journalist, writing some essays, but also some reported pieces. And so, I think I was generally interested in distributional questions at the heart of economics, especially as it just was sort of painfully clear, that even people like in Palo Alto, where Stanford is, like even people who make well over 6 figures are eligible for subsidized housing. Right? And so you sort of look at that and you think, if that's who qualifies for low-income housing, like what does that say about the economy? It was hard not to be thinking about economic questions in that kind of environment. And then realizing just how often these economic questions get naturalized, right? And what I mean by that is that the philosophical dimension of the question gets stripped away. And the current distribution of income, for instance, is just treated as a natural kind rather than a reflection of policy decisions. All of that's a long-winded way of saying that, I got interested in the sort of economic stuff, partly by where I was living, partly through the intellectual route in of reading a lot of philosophy. More specifically, what led to the book was actually living overseas. So we were living in Athens, Greece for 3 years. My wife's an archaeologist, was doing research at the end of her dissertation there. So we were in Greece, and I was fortunate to have an editor at The New Yorker who really gave me a pretty long leash to go after interesting policy stories around Europe. So I was in Spain at the Mondragon Co-ops, world's largest worker-owned co-ops. I was in Austria for a job guarantee experiment. I have chapters that look at a city in Lisbon, outside of Lisbon, Portugal, on participatory budgeting, climate budgeting in Oslo. So being able to look around Europe at interesting case studies of different economic arrangement, different policies and programs that sort of don't presuppose some of the same premises that a lot of arrangements in America treat as natural. That was another eye-opening experience. And so, like a lot of people think of philosophy as like not empirical, right? But the whole thing you're doing in journalism is like you're trying to gather information. You may not be doing it in a social science way with representative samples or double-blind studies like you might in a medical trial, but like you are trying to learn about the world by gathering information, right, from human sources and from documents and other kinds of sources. So I think that's like another thing that's a necessary sort of check on the abstraction of philosophy, is like journalism is this other mode of gaining knowledge.
And intensely personal and intensely human, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is personal. And you're also
Instead of hiding behind data, We're sharing people's stories, right?
For sure. Yes. Right? Yes, that's right. I think that's, the way in for a lot of journalism is like narrative. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You meet someone and it's instantly, psychologically, it just makes a different impression, right? Like the sort of joke in social science is like the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So there's a sort of disdain for narrative. But I think the flip of that is also important, where it's like, the singular of data, datum, doesn't speak to many people. You actually do need a story to understand data.
You sure do.
So I think that's another thing that journalism
Yeah, and I think we'll circle back to that in a bit. But aside from being a writer, you're also a professor. So I kind of want to discuss your approach to teaching. What do you see in journalism programs across the country today? What kind of appreciation is there for history in these programs? And maybe tell us a little bit about what you do to infuse your history history in general, maybe intellectual history, into some of the things that you do with students.
That's a great question and probably a whole nother podcast conversation to do it justice. But I'll just say a few things.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I'm an odd person to be teaching journalism. I never studied journalism formally, and I sort of have the sense that one doesn't necessarily need to become proficient at it. I think learning it by doing it is very possible, and with sort of good mentors and the right opportunities, I think you don't actually need to study it formally. If you are going to spend some time studying it, there are two kind of conflicting views about the best use of that time. One view, I think, treats it more like an extension of a liberal arts degree, where actually what you should be doing is reading deeply in, the history of American foreign policy or the history of economics or whatever it is you're interested in. You should be gaining subject expertise.
Specialization. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but sort of, non-vocational would be the key thing, because the other view is like what you're doing in journalism is you're learning a trade. And so what you should do in journalism school is you should learn like how to do public record requests. You should learn interviewing techniques. You should learn, to have the AP style book memorized, how to structure different stories. Very kind of vocational. So this tension is very much present, especially in recent years, where cost of education goes up. Students understandably get very fixated on sort of return on investment. And so if you get too far into sort of intellectual things that don't have an immediate apparent relevance, oftentimes there's skepticism. It's like, why would we want to be reading books or novels? I mean, some people might say like, a journalist will do their job much better if they've read all of Dostoevsky, right? It's like, that's not an immediately true claim, but I think it's a defensible one. But if you try to make that in certain environments where people are going hugely into debt, I think there's an understandable skepticism. That's a tension that I don't think has been successfully resolved. My own view, I'm sort of more sympathetic to the liberal arts side of that argument, that journalists can learn a lot of the practical skills on the job. Whereas if they can gain a sort of deep expertise in some area, that's going to help them as journalists in the future. So, like, for instance, there's a new program at UC Berkeley where I teach in the journalism school, where students will get a certificate in business journalism. So in the fall, I'm teaching one course in a sequence of courses that ends with that certificate. My approach to that course is based around like the history of economics. Trying to understand where a lot of the concepts we have today come from. Even something like GDP, right? Didn't exist in the 19th century. When and why did this become an ostensibly reasonable way of measuring growth that then became widely reported? Every major media outlet is often fixated on GDP, interest rates. I mean, if you haven't sort of read the history of economics, it's natural just to think of these things, again, as natural kinds.
They've been given to us. They've been handed down. right?
They have, but it's easy to think that they've been discovered in the same way that the atomic weight of a molecule is discovered rather than sort of created or invented. So that's one example of how I'm going to try to infuse history into the curriculum at Berkeley's J School.
I love it. I love it. So as you think about our media today, what kind of recurring stories do you feel like have a good balance of history and coverage? And maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the economic reportage here. And relatedly, which subjects do we tend to see a deficit of good historical contextualization?
That's such a good question. I think, again, we'd want a whole podcast for that, right? But a few thoughts, maybe to start with something I think journalism generally doesn't do a great job on, and that's sort of business or financial journalism, which, often sort of falls into a kind of predictable cheerleading for sort of pro-growth neoliberalism.
Some boosterism.
Yeah, like hagiography of founders, fixation on the markets, understandable if your base of readers is like retiring baby boomers whose 401k balance is very important to them. Like, then it's easy to sort of fall into a type of journalism that just is tracking fluctuations in markets, but not really asking any deeper questions about the externalities of those the companies in those markets create in the world. Or, I think a good analogy sometimes for business journalism is climate journalism, right? So there was a time when sort of people covering the climate were essentially just like weathermen or weatherwomen, right? They would say like, here's the weather is like. Exactly, right? And they would say, it's going to rain this week, there's going to be clouds, just a sort of description of what the weather is doing. Now, over time, people started to notice patterns in the weather, and they started to notice causal relationships and change over time, and that becomes climate reporting, right? Where there's like this enormous fact that if you miss it, you're missing the story. I think the same thing is true with financial journalism, but we're still in the weather person phase of it, where right now a lot of people who are financial or business journalists, they just point to phenomena. And it's like saying, the wind is blowing. It's going to rain next week. They say, markets are doing this. Trade is looking like that.
Now, do you think that has to do, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Do you think that has to do with space? Just words and space? Is there not enough kind of leash given to some of these journalists who are maybe doing these stories? Or what's your sense there? Sorry to get kind of into the weeds here.
I mean, I think, unfortunately, it's probably not an issue of space so much as it is of sort of being captive to a certain ideology. So I think a lot of the editors and journalists who report and write in that vein are sort of, they have yet to make the transition from weather person to climate journalist. So they have yet to sort of notice causes and patterns and try to seek deeper explanatory levels. This is a huge generalization. There are lots of good journalists who write on...
And I'm sure wonderful editors too, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But, generalizations...
we need them.
They capture part of the world, right? They have some validity. So that's sort of my negative example of where a lack of historical and critical thinking shows up in pretty, asinine coverage in a lot of the mainstream media.
Yeah.
One could also do a sort of similar critique of, say, American foreign policy, where a lot of the history of America's intervention in countries around the world is elided from contemporary coverage. Whether that's space or ideology, one could debate, but it's a suspicious pattern how, people in mainstream media often just have very limited understanding of what American foreign policy looked like in the 20th century, and so a lot of their coverage can read as like somewhat naive. I'm struggling a little bit to come up with the more positive example.
I was just going to come back to that.
Yeah.
I was looking down. Wait a second. Did Nick give us any positive examples?
Well, I think the positive examples are sort of like individual journalists, right? So like there are people at certain publications with certain beats who are enormously impressive in their command of the details and the history of certain things. Some of them are historians, right? I mean, one thinks about like someone like Jill Lepore, for instance, at The New Yorker. So she's history professor, but also a New Yorker staff writer.
Yeah.
There are these people who are often sort of extraordinary in various dimensions, but you read her essays and it's, of course, infused with deep historical understanding. I mean, she just had a very nice piece in the New York Times about Elon Musk's grandfather. Right?
Powerful piece. A powerful
Very
piece.
interesting, but like hard to imagine that. Well,
An incredible amount of archival digging.
Absolutely.
She does
right?
a lot of work in the archives, right?
So that's like, I think that's, if you think about the sort of Venn diagram, there's this nice sweet spot where journalism and historian overlaps and the two circles cross. And there's some journalists who do that sort of research, and then there's some historians who do that sort of writing for the public. And they're all in that overlapping space. And I think it's a really rich space, but it probably is a minority, right? There's more of both circles outside the overlap.
And I guess my question I keep coming back to is, how do we get more journalists into that space that you're describing, right? Is that journalism schools? Is that just general kind of education requirements across the country for undergraduates? What's your sense?
Those are useful and helpful. I would support broader historical education in J school. Better training for undergraduates in history would be wonderful. It seems important also just to at least gesture at the political economy of journalism itself here. So because a lot of the business model is sort of in free fall, they're sort of chasing after.
So many good journalists are on Substack and trying to individually make a go of it now too, because we just have this institutional failure, right?
So, I think a lot of it is, these are well-worn arguments at this point, but I think it's true to say that a lot of what gets prioritized in newsrooms and by editors is just what gets people riled up on social media. And so the
algorithms.
Yeah, the chasing after outrage, the sort of efforts to activate tribalism with every story, with a framing of every issue. Whose side are you on? It's hard to do that style of journalism while also having like lots of patience for historical nuance,
deep historical context about Gaza, right?
Exactly. And so I think a lot of the blame for the current fractured information ecosystem does lie with social media companies. And if you really wanted to sort of have editors and publications give more space to sort of patient, long-form analysis of issues, at some level what we're talking about would be like reconfiguring human attention in the modern world so that humans pay attention to nuance and like read long articles patiently. That's a much larger and more ambitious undertaking that would require I'm thinking 0 to 18 changes in education.
I was just about to say, I feel like we need some K through 12 changes, right?
Totally. And banning phones in schools is becoming more and more common. So I think people are starting to realize just how destructive early addiction to screens is cognitively.
Right.
But there's a long way to go, definitely.
Wow. Wonderful response. Thank you so much for that. And since I am a historian and this is good history, I am going to have to broach this topic. And what do you see as the legacy of the 1619 project? Started by a journalist, right? What did you think about the responses to it?
It's been a few years since I looked at that closely. I have a sort of vague memory of how quickly it got polarized on both sides, such that I felt like sort of reasonable critique in both directions quickly ended up just sort of branding people with either like you're racist or you're like a woke fascist, and sort of I felt like the name calling in both directions was incredibly unhelpful, and like the casualty once again was kind of nuance and history.
Yeah.
So that's not a very specific answer about that project. I know there were lots of sort of acclaimed historians of the Civil War era and of earlier in American history who felt like the treatment of race was a little unnuanced and a little sort of polemical and polarizing. I don't sort of have the expertise to comment on that specifically, but I do think there's a general tendency, not just with that project, but with a lot of different works of history. I mean, I'm thinking of the ancient world now, which is like also a sort of partisan minefield where you now have sort of people on the far right who idolize like Spartans and this kind of like somewhat mythological view of like warfare in antiquity. And like if you talk to historians of ancient warfare, there's a lot more nuance there once again. And so then on the other hand, you have people who are wanting to sort of go so far as to say like all of antiquity, Greece and Rome is just founded on like exclusion and racism. And those folks I think often end up importing very sort of ahistorical ways of analyzing issues into the past where like race was thought about differently. Like it's actually not super meaningful to think about like ancient Greeks as white. Like that didn't exist in that world. And many of them had different skin pigmentation.
Right.
I think in general, whenever sort of culture wars start to spill over into historical analysis, it's like a fairly late stage of the disease of polarization. So I think it's alarming to see that like now even the past has just become like one more minefield that people sort of have cherry-picked evidence on both sides to sort of buttress their contemporary culture wars issues. I guess I just find it sort of depressing, and like the thing that I think
it coheres with your last answer, right? Too, about our attention and our capacity for nuance, right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think like one thing that's great about history is that there's often just a sort of strangeness or foreignness. I mean, like the famous sentence of L.P. Hartley's wonderful novel, The Go-Between, is, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. I think like studying history in a way is like travel. It's without even needing a passport. You can go to that foreign country that Hartley's mentioning. And so like what a shame to just go into that country and then hallucinate contemporary culture war issues everywhere you look. Right? Like it's like that's a good way to miss the plot.
Miss the story.
Yeah.
Miss the lead.
Yeah.
So what do you think historians have to learn from journalists?
Yeah, I mean, some historians are very good writers. In general, I don't think academia sort of prioritizes clarity or style, like just having like a sort of stylish capacity to convey information in an interesting way, like understanding how to structure a narrative or an argument so that people actually want to keep reading. I think historians can learn a lot from journalists, but also from essayists, from novelists. I think a big thing is just how to be an effective writer, right? I think anyone can learn, for instance, from like George Orwell's essay, Politics in the English Language, sort of a classic masterclass in what to do and what not to do. Applies to journalists, applies to academic writers. So I think that's the main thing, is prose style and how to structure an argument or a story so that it's actually aesthetic at some level. Like people want to read it because it's pleasing and beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
So stories, but well-told stories.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that takes, I think, time and space. And just from, the academic perspective, sometimes the time and space is in short supply when you've got students in service and whatnot. But I'm not defending that at all. I think, writing for the public, as you've said, is just absolutely indispensable, certainly at this moment too, right?
Yeah.
So what's next for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not going to say too much about a next book project. I am working on a few things. I'm interested, as I'm interested in the sort of history of ancient philosophy, and I think there are important themes to draw out from that for a general readership. So I'm interested in writing more on sort of intellectual history for a popular audience. I've done some of that in essays, but having done a full book that's based on reporting on a sort of New Yorker style template, I'm interested also in a sort of cultural and philosophical history and thinking about ways to shape a narrative out of that.
That sounds delightful. I think we could use that right about now. So, and now I'm going to do a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests on Good History. So here it goes. These days, here in the 21st century, history and humanities are struggling to demonstrate our relevance to college students and, I suppose, the public. We're told focusing on history is a bad career move. At the same time, Americans consume history enthusiastically. We buy books, watch Netflix documentaries, enjoy Hollywood films set in historical periods, and we appeal to history all of the time. Think of debates and discussions of contemporary issues, which we've talked about on this podcast, and how often we hear, well, history tells us something or other. So what do you make of the apparent paradox here between history struggling for oxygen inside of universities and its popularity outside the walls of the academy?
You know, the first thing that comes to mind is just that college costs too much for people to be able to pursue what they find interesting. So if you look around the world in countries where there's a lower cost of attending college, not only do people at an undergraduate level study the humanities in higher numbers, but graduate students as well. If you have a free or close to free master's degree in something, and if you also have some level of social safety net, there's not a lot of downside to spending part of your 20s or even your 30s pursuing a degree in ancient Roman history or whatever it is. I mean, I think one thing that also gets lost, and this connects to the very first thing we talked about the value of accessing concepts that are really accessible only with knowledge of a foreign language. One example of that is when people say liberal arts today, they typically are referring to the humanities. Those have sort of become synonymous in the minds of a lot of people. Actually, the liberal arts, the term comes from Latin, and in ancient Rome, the liberal arts included what we would today class as like science and math subjects, right?
Yeah.
What distinguishes liberal from unliberal study is the spirit in which you approach it. So liberal is actually befitting of someone who is free. So I think without being too polemical, you could say that a lot of people today, in every subject in college, they approach it in an unfree spirit. They are only using the class as a means to the end of employment. So reframing what the point of school is would require a different economic model for education. You'd have to have something closer to, the GI Bill in the 50s, which I think not coincidentally, there was a huge flowering of intellectual work in lots of different fields in the post-war period in America when college
huge appreciation for literature and art, right?
Totally, yeah. But, if you study a subject, whether or not you're doing it as a means to an end may actually determine like your experience of how interesting it is. Everyone has had the experience of being told like you have to do this, and it's kind of less fun. It's a little bit boring if you're forced to do something.
Yeah.
Whereas, thinking that you could actually be a liberal arts major who studies pure math or theoretical physics, what would make that a liberal course of study would be your own internal motivation. You're not doing it in order to then go get a job building the next AI. You're doing it just because it's interesting. And you may actually go do something very different after college.
Or you may do that. I think that's the point. It can prepare you to think broadly and widely, and it also helps us, learn how to learn in a way, right?
Right. I guess what seems important is to push back on the instrumentalizing of knowledge, where it's a means to the end of employment. I mean, I think if you wanted any kind of means and justification, you'd want to make the end something larger, like how to live a good life.
Yeah.
Right? Part of living a good life, arguably, is like learning to appreciate major intellectual achievements and sort of modes of inquiry, whether those are in the natural sciences or the humanistic realm. I think reframing it as like this is part of a good life is important. But in order for that not to sound like a sort of empty idealism, I do think it should be coupled with just dramatic reduction in the cost of attending college so that many more people in the population can access this kind of liberal study in the original sense of liberal, freeing.
Yeah, and it just kind of reminds me that I think the percentage of undergrads pursuing humanities degrees at the 2-year level, at the community college level, which is far more attainable financially, is greater than it is at the 4-year schools.
Totally. Right? Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I think another bit of evidence from sort of a different direction for what we're talking about is like when you take a purely instrumental view of education and you start cutting liberal arts, what gets cut actually is not only the humanities. There are many schools around the country now that are either in the process of or that have already closed subjects or departments that do subjects like math, physics, because they want to have what's perceived as marketable skill. And it's actually, there are huge branches of knowledge within the natural sciences that are not very marketable. You study those things sort of in the same spirit as someone studying poetry, because it's interesting, because it's beautiful, because it reflects a particular sort of human cognitive potential that's being realized, not because the market is telling you there's a lot of return on investment for knowing this obscure branch of whatever field, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I think there's a sort of mistake that people make when they think the humanities are the only thing that's at risk. Actually, the attack on liberal arts cuts across the entire range of disciplines. It
sure does. And thinking about the math department at West Virginia, I think, was famously cut this past year. So we have one last question we want to ask all our guests, and that's the party question. It goes like this. When you are in gatherings of one sort or another, I'm sure you field history questions or questions about history. If you had to decide, what would be the question you wish someone would ask you?
I don't think that I long for people to ask me questions about history necessarily, but I do enjoy having good conversations with people who are sort of interested in topics and ideas for their own sake rather than as a means to the end of, you know, displaying their erudition or making a lot of money or whatever else. I think all of those approaches to ideas are the opposite of liberal, right? They're unfree. Someone is actually then kind of enslaved in an important sense to their...
bound.
Yeah, to their desires for status or for money. And so, I think the most important feature I look for in kind of intellectual interlocutors is, I'll close again with another hard to translate Greek word, which is aphthonos. In Plato, that's a term that gets used sometimes for the interlocutors that Socrates is dealing with. Some of them are very intent on winning the argument, on being right.
Yeah. Others
approach it in a more philosophical spirit, and that word aphthonos describes the second type of conversationalist, and it's like someone who's without envy or without spite. So someone who's approaching the conversation devoid of those emotions is someone who's aphthonos. More positively, they're genuinely philosophically curious about the topic at hand.
Right.
So whatever the topic is, if someone approaches it with that spirit, it's going to be a good conversation.
Good faith.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for exploring good history with us, Nick. And thanks to the Good History team, my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Griswold and Dr. Brian Hosmer, Christina Rogers, a PhD candidate in our department, and Jesse Ulrich, Chief Executive of Rant 9 Productions, Good History producer and trained historian. And remember, the only bad history is history we don't know.